So here's the thing. We're not going to start at the beginning of this epic war. Nope, we're jumping right to the very end. We're starting with the heart-wrenching lament of the blind king, Dhritarashtra, right after his 100 sons have been slaughtered in battle. So he's talking to his advisor, Sanjaya, and he starts this haunting list. But here's the crazy part. It's not a list of battles he lost. It's a list of all these moments, years before the war even started, where he just knew they were doomed. It was a premonition of failure he'd been living with for a long, long time. You want to know one of the first red flags for the king? This right here. His own sons, right? They build this palace made of super flammable stuff, like wax and lacquer, with the brilliant idea of trapping their cousins, the 5 Pandava brothers, and just burning them alive. And what happens? They escape. For the king, this wasn't just, oh, they got lucky. No, this was a sign of their incredible cleverness, and maybe, just maybe, that someone was watching over them. And boom, there it is again. That same phrase. Every single memory he brings up, he ends it with those words. He's hammering it home, right? This wasn't some shock. For him, this was a catastrophe he saw coming from a mile away. It was an inevitability he had to live with. And this is where it gets really wild. This next moment, it was actually a win for the king's sons. They used a rigged dice game to steal an entire kingdom. And on top of that, they dragged their cousin's shared wife, Draupadi, out and humiliate her in front of the entire court. But even in what should have been their big moment, the king felt it, that cold dread. He knew you just don't do something that awful and get away with it. And let's be super clear here, this is not him looking back and connecting the dots. The king is telling us how he felt in that exact moment. That victory, it must have tasted like ashes. It was a giant blinking sign that his sons had just crossed a line they could never uncross. Okay, but this next one, this might be the most bone-chilling moment of all. The divine being, Krishna himself, comes to their court to try and make peace. A last-ditch effort, And what do the king's sons do? They try to arrest him. They try to put a god in chains. And Krishna's response? He just reveals his true, terrifying, cosmic form. I mean, they didn't just pick a fight with their cousins. They tried to chain up the entire universe. I mean, after that, what hope could there possibly be? They'd basically declared war on reality itself. And that's pretty much the last nail in the coffin. The king's lament ends there. But it leaves us with this huge, fascinating question. Who's actually telling us this story? Who are we hearing this from? See, we're not getting this firsthand. The story of the king and his sorrow, it's actually being told to us by this traveling bard, a guy named Saudi. He's reciting it for a group of wise sages out in a forest. So what we're doing is basically listening in on an ancient performance. We're part of an audience that's hearing a story about another audience hearing a story. It's a story within a story. And the epic has a special word for itself, itihasa. This is super important because it's not calling itself a fairy tale or just a poem. It's calling itself a sacred history. The word literally means, thus it was. So it's framing itself not as fiction, but as a record of what actually happened. So you can see the story is passed down like a relay race, a chain of narration. It starts with the author, the sage Vyasa. He thinks up the whole thing. Then he teaches it to his student Vaisampayana. Vaisampayana is the first one to recite it out loud for a big audience. And that's where our guy, the bard Sauti, hears it. He then takes it on the road and retells it to the sages and to us. We're at the end of this incredible telephone game of history. All right, so let's rewind. Let's go all the way back to the very beginning, to the author, Vyasa. So this guy has just come up with the most massive, mind-blowing epic poem ever. But he has a pretty unique problem. There's literally no one on earth who can write it down fast enough for him. That was his big dilemma. The poem was just too big, too complicated, and it was pouring out of his mind way too fast for any normal person to keep up. Talk about a writer's problem, huh? The greatest story ever told, and no way to get it on paper. So the god Brahma gives him a tip. Pray to Ganesha, the god who removes obstacles. Makes sense, right? Ganesha shows up and says, "Sure, I'll be your scribe, but," and it's a big but, he has one condition, a seemingly impossible one. "Once I start writing, my pen can never stop, not even for a second." In this, right here is where you see Vyasa's genius at work. He comes back with a brilliant counteroffer. He says, deal, but you have to fully understand the meaning of every single line before you write it down. Ganesha agrees. And just like that, Vyasa has bought himself time. He's created the mental pause he needs to stay ahead. So to make sure he could keep up with a god, Vyasa cooked up 8,800 verses that were deliberately, insanely complex. They were like these little narrative speed bumps. The text even says that even the all-knowing Ganesha had to pause for a moment to think about them. And in that little pause, that's when Vyasa would compose the next batch of verses. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, let's jump back to our grieving king, the Dhritarashtra. He's so broken by his loss, he's ready to just end it all. But his counselor, Sanjaya, doesn't offer him a shoulder to cry on. Instead, he gives him this deep, philosophical reality check. Sanjaya starts listing all these legendary kings from the past. I mean, we're talking about heroes and rulers who were way more powerful, way more righteous than any of the king's sons ever were. And what's the point? Every single one of them, no matter how great, met their end. Fate comes for everyone. This is Sanjaya's big lesson right here. No one gets to sidestep their destiny. Everything, life, death, happiness, sadness, it all comes from one source, time. Time is this unstoppable force that builds everything up and then tears it all down. You simply cannot beat it. So all of this kind of leads to a really big question, right? Why on earth would anyone tell a story this massive and honestly this tragic? Well, the epic itself gives us the answer, using these amazing metaphors to explain its own reason for being. The story describes itself as a giant tree. You've got the histories of the families as the roots, the main characters are the trunk, the big war is all the branches. But, and this is the most important part, the book that comes after all the fighting, the book of peace, that's the fruit of the tree. The whole terrible, painful journey is there to produce this one beautiful thing, wisdom. Now, the version we have today, the one for us mortals, is about 100,000 verses long, which is a lot. But the story itself hints that this is just the short version. It suggests there are even bigger, more complete versions out there in the realms of the gods. And there's this one great story about how the poem got its name. The gods wanted to figure out just how important this thing really was. So they set up these giant celestial scales. On one side, they put their most holy scriptures, all 4 Vedas, and on the other side, they put Vyasa's epic, the Mahabharata. So, what happened? The Mahabharata was heavier. It literally outweighed the 4 Vedas put together. The gods decided it had more substance, more gravity. And from that moment on, the legend says, the poem earned its new name, the Mahabharata, the Great Mahabharata. And that kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it? We're left with this story of loss, a story that claims it's greater than even the most sacred texts because it holds all the messiness and wisdom and pain of being alive. And it leaves us with one last thing to think about. Why do we do this? Why do we keep telling ourselves these epic stories that remind us that everything, even the most beautiful and magnificent things, will eventually end?